Part 3, Chapter 3 of Madame Bovary. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Icy Jumbo. Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. Translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. Part 2, Chapter 3. The next day, as she was getting up, she saw the clerk on the Place. She had on a dressing gown. He looked up and bowed. She nodded quickly and reclosed the window. Léon waited all day for 6 o'clock in the evening to come, but on going to the inn he found no one but Monsieur Binet already at table. The dinner of the evening before had been a considerable event for him. He had never till then talked for 2 hours consecutively to a lady. How then had he been able to explain, and in such language, the number of things that he could not have said so well before? He was usually shy, and maintained that reserve which partakes at once of modesty and dissimulation. At Yonville he was considered well bred. He listened to the arguments of the older people, and did not seem hot about politics, a remarkable thing for a young man. Then he had some sort of accomplishments. He painted in watercolours, could read the key of G, and readily talked literature after dinner when he did not play cards. Monsieur Homais respected him for his education. Madame Homais liked him for his good nature, for he often took the little Homais into the garden. Little brats who were always dirty, very much spoilt, and somewhat lymphatic, like their mother. Besides the servant to look after them, they had Justin, the chemist's apprentice, a second cousin of Monsieur Homais, who had been taken into the house from charity, and who was useful at the same time as a servant. The druggist proved the best of neighbours. He gave Madame Bovary information as to the tradespeople, sent expressly for his own cider merchant, tasted the drink himself, and saw that the casks were properly placed in the cellar. He explained how to set about getting in a supply of butter cheap, and made an arrangement with Lestiboudois, the sacristan, who, besides his sacerdotal and funeral functions, looked after the principal gardens at Yonville by the hour or the year, according to the taste of the customers. The need of looking after others was not the only thing that urged the chemist to such obsequious cordiality. There was a plan underneath it all. He had infringed the law of the 19th Ventose, year 11, article 1, which forbade all persons not having a diploma to practise medicine, so that, after certain anonymous denunciations, Homais had been summoned to Rouen to see the procurer of the king in his own private room, the magistrate receiving him standing up, ermine on shoulder and cap on head. It was in the morning, before the court opened. In the corridors one heard the heavy boots of the gendarme walking past, and like a far-off noise, great locks that were shut. The druggist's ears tingled as if he were about to have an apoplectic stroke. He saw the depths of dungeons, his family in tears, his shops sold, all the jars dispersed, and he was obliged to enter a café and take a glass of rum and seltzer to recover his spirits. Little by little the memory of this reprimand grew fainter, and he continued, as heretofore, to give anodyne consultations in his back parlour. But the mayor resented it, his colleagues were jealous, everything was to be feared. Gaining over Monsieur Bovary by his attentions was to earn his gratitude, and prevent his speaking out later on, should he notice anything. So, every morning Homais brought him the paper, and often in the afternoon left his shop for a few moments to have a chat with the doctor. Charles was dull. Patients did not come. He remained seated for hours without speaking, went into his consulting room to sleep, or watched his wife sewing. Then, for diversion, he employed himself at home as a workman. He even tried to do up the attic with some paint which had been left behind by the painters. But money matters worried him. He had spent so much for the repairs at Tostes, for Madame's toilette, and for the moving, that the whole dowry, over 3,000 crowns, had slipped away in 2 years. Then how many things had been spoilt or lost during their carriage from Tostes to Yonville, without counting the plaster curé, who, falling out of the couch on an over-severe jolt, had been dashed into 1,000 fragments on the pavements of Quincampoix. A pleasanter trouble came to distract him, namely, the pregnancy of his wife. As the time of her confinement approached, he cherished her the more. It was another bond of the flesh establishing itself, and, as it were, a continued sentiment of a more complex union. When from afar he saw her languid walk, and her figure without stays turning softly on her hips. When opposite one another, he looked at her at his ease, while she took tired poses in her armchair. Then his happiness knew no bounds. He got up, embraced her, passed his hands over her face, called her little mamma, wanted to make her dance, and half laughing, half crying, uttered all kinds of caressing pleasantries that came into his head. The idea of having begotten a child delighted him. Now he wanted nothing. He knew human life from end to end, and he sat down to it with serenity. Emma at first felt a great astonishment, then was anxious to be delivered that she might know what it was to be a mother. But not being able to spend as much as she would have liked, to have a swing bassinet with rose silk curtains and embroidered caps, in a fit of bitterness she gave up looking after the trousseau, and ordered the whole of it from a village needlewoman, without choosing or discussing anything. Thus she did not amuse herself with those preparations that stimulate the tenderness of mothers, and so her affection was, from the very outset, perhaps, to some extent attenuated. As Charles, however, spoke of the boy at every meal, she soon began to think of him more consecutively. She hoped for a son. He would be strong and dark. She would call him Georges, and this idea of having a male child was like an expected revenge for all her impotence in the past. A man, at least, is free. He may travel over passions and over countries, overcome obstacles, taste of the most far-away pleasures. But a woman is always hampered. At once inert and flexible, she has against her the weakness of the flesh and legal dependence. Her will, like the veil of her bonnet held by a string, flutters in every wind. There is always some desire that draws her, some conventionality that restrains. She was confined on a Sunday at about 6 o'clock, as the sun was rising. "It is a girl," said Charles. She turned her head away and fainted. Madame Homais, as well as Madame Lefrançois of the Lion d'Or, almost immediately came running in to embrace her. The chemist, as a man of discretion, only offered a few provincial felicitations through the half-opened door. He wished to see the child, and thought it well made. Whilst she was getting well, she occupied herself much in seeking a name for her daughter. First, she went over all those that have Italian endings, such as Clara, Louisa, Amanda, Atala. She liked Galsiunde pretty well, and Iseult and Léocadie still better. Charles wanted the child to be called after her mother. Emma opposed this. They ran over the calendar from end to end, and then consulted outsiders. "Monsieur Léon," said the chemist, "with whom I was talking about it the other day, wonders you do not choose Madeleine. It is very much in fashion just now." But Madame Bovary senior cried out loudly against this name of a sinner. As to Monsieur Homais, he had a preference for all those that recalled some great man, an illustrious fact, or a generous idea, and it was on this system that he had baptized his 4 children. Thus Napoleon represented glory, and Franklin liberty. Irma was perhaps a concession to romanticism, but Athalie was a homage to the greatest masterpiece of the French stage, for his philosophical convictions did not interfere with his artistic tastes. In him the thinker did not stifle the man of sentiment. He could make distinctions, make allowances for imagination and fanaticism. In this tragedy, for example, he found fault with the ideas, but admired the style. He detested the conception, but applauded all the details, and loathed the characters, while he grew enthusiastic over their dialogue. When he read the fine passages, he was transported, but when he thought that mummers would get something out of them for their show, he was disconsolate, and in this confusion of sentiments in which he was involved, He would have liked at once to crown Racine with both his hands and discuss with him for a good quarter of an hour. At last Emma remembered that at the château of Vaubyessard she had heard the Marchioness call a young lady Berthe. From that moment this name was chosen, and as old Rouault could not come, Monsieur Homais was requested to stand godfather. His gifts were all products from his establishment, to wit, 6 boxes of jujubes, a whole jar of racahout, 3 cakes of marshmallow paste, and 6 sticks of sugar candy into the bargain that he had come across in a cupboard. On the evening of the ceremony there was a grand dinner. The curé was present. There was much excitement. Monsieur Homais, towards liqueur time, began singing Le Dieu des bons gens. Monsieur Léon sang a barcarolle, and Madame Bovary senior, who was godmother, a romance of the time of the Empire. Finally, Monsieur Bovary senior insisted on having the child brought down, and began baptizing it with a glass of champagne that he poured over its head. This mockery of the first of the sacraments made the Abbé Bournisien angry. Old Bovary replied by a quotation from La Guerre des Dieux. The curé wanted to leave. The ladies implored. Homais interfered, and they succeeded in making the priest sit down again, and he quietly went on with the half-finished coffee in his saucer. Monsieur Bovary senior stayed at Yonville a month, dazzling the natives by a superb policeman's cap with silver tassels that he wore in the morning when he smoked his pipe in the square. Being also in the habit of drinking a good deal of brandy, he often sent the servant to the Lion d'Or to buy him a bottle, which was put down to his son's account, and to perfume his handkerchiefs he used up his daughter-in-law's whole supply of eau de cologne. The latter did not at all dislike his company. He had knocked about the world. He talked about Berlin, Vienna, and Strasbourg, of his soldier times, of the mistresses he had had, the grand luncheons of which he had partaken. Then he was amiable, and sometimes even, either on the stairs or in the garden, would seize hold of her waist, crying, "Charles, look out for yourself!" Then Madame Bovary senior became alarmed for her son's happiness, and fearing that her husband might in the long run have an immoral influence upon the ideas of the young woman, took care to hurry their departure. Perhaps she had more serious reasons for uneasiness. Monsieur Bovary was not the man to respect anything. One day Emma was suddenly seized with the desire to see her little girl, who had been put to nurse with the carpenter's wife, and, without looking at the calendar to see whether the 6 weeks of the Virgin were yet past, she set out for the Rolets' house, situated at the extreme end of the village, between the high road and the fields. It was midday. The shutters of the houses were closed, and the slate roofs that glittered beneath the fierce light of the blue sky seemed to strike sparks from the rest of the gables. A heavy wind was blowing. Emma felt weak as she walked. The stones of the pavement hurt her. She was doubtful whether she would not go home again, or go in somewhere to rest. At this moment Monsieur Léon came out from a neighbouring door, with a bundle of papers under his arm. He came to greet her, and stood in the shade in front of the Lheureux's shop under the projecting grey awning. Madame Bovary said she was going to see her baby, but that she was beginning to grow tired. "If," said Léon, not daring to go on. "Have you any business to attend to?" she asked. And on the clerk's answer she begged him to accompany her. That same evening this was known in Yonville, and Madame Tuvache, the mayor's wife, declared in the presence of her servant that Madame Bovary was compromising herself. To get to the nurse's it was necessary to turn to the left on leaving the street, as if making for the cemetery, and to follow between little houses and yards a small path bordered with privet hedges. They were in bloom, and so were the speedwells, eglantines, thistles, and the sweetbriar that sprang up from the thickets. Through openings in the hedges one could see into the huts, some pigs on a dung-heap, or tethered cows rubbing their horns against the trunk of trees. The two, side by side, walked slowly, she leaning upon him, and he restraining his pace, which he regulated by hers. In front of them a swarm of midges fluttered, buzzing in the warm air. They recognized the house by an old walnut tree which shaded it. Low, and covered with brown tiles, there hung outside it, beneath the dormer window of the garret, a string of onions. Faggots upright against a thorn fence surrounded a bed of lettuce, a few square feet of lavender, and sweet peas strung on sticks. Dirty water was running here and there on the grass, and all round were several indefinite rags, knitted stockings, a red calico jacket, and a large sheet of coarse linen spread over the hedge. At the noise of the gate, the nurse appeared with a baby she was suckling on one arm. With her other hand she was pulling along a poor puny fellow, his face covered with scrofula, the son of a Rouen hosier, whom his parents, too taken up with their business, left in the country. "Go in," she said, "your little one is there asleep." The room on the ground floor, the only one in the dwelling, had at its further end, against the wall, a large bed without curtains, while a kneading trough took up the side by the window, one pane of which was mended with a piece of blue paper. In the corner behind the door, shining hobnailed shoes stood in a row under the slab of the washstand, near a bottle of oil with a feather stuck in its mouth. A Mathieu Leinsberg lay on the dusty mantelpiece amid gunflints, candle ends, and bits of amadou. Finally, the last luxury in the apartment was a Fame blowing her trumpets, a picture cut out, no doubt, from some perfumer's prospectus, and nailed to the wall with 6 wooden shoe-pegs. Emma's child was asleep in a wicker cradle. She took it up in the wrapping that enveloped it, and began singing softly as she rocked herself to and fro. Léon walked up and down the room. It seemed strange to him to see this beautiful woman in her nankeen dress in the midst of all this poverty. Madame Bovary reddened. He turned away, thinking perhaps there had been an impertinent look in his eyes. Then she put back the little girl, who had just been sick over her collar. The nurse came at once to dry her, protesting that it wouldn't show. "She gives me other doses," she said. "I am always a washing of her. If you would have the goodness to order Camus, the grocer, to let me have a little soap, it really would be more convenient for you, as I needn't trouble you then." very well," said Emma. "Good morning, Madame Rollet." And she went out, wiping her shoes at the door. The good woman accompanied her to the end of the garden, talking all the time of the trouble she had getting up of nights. "I'm that worn out sometimes as I drop asleep on my chair. I'm sure you might at least give me just a pound of ground coffee. That'd last me a month, and I'd take it of a morning with some milk." After having submitted to her thanks, Madame Bovary left. She had gone a little way down the path, when at the sound of wooden shoes she turned round. It was the nurse. "What is it?" Then the peasant woman, taking her aside behind an elm tree, began talking to her of her husband, who, with his trade and 6 francs a year that the captain— "Oh, be quick!" said Emma. "Well," the nurse went on, heaving sighs between each word, "I'm afraid he'll be put out seeing me have coffee alone. You know men." "But you are to have some," Emma repeated. "I will give you some. You bother me." "Oh dear, my poor dear lady. You see, in consequence of his wounds, he has terrible cramps in the chest. He even says that cider weakens him." "Do make haste, Mère Rollet." "Well," the latter continued, making a curtsy, "if it weren't asking too much," and she curtsied once more, "if you would—" and her eyes begged. "A jar of brandy," she said at last, "and I'd rub your little one's feet with it. They're as tender as one's tongue." Once rid of the nurse, Emma again took Monsieur Léon's arm. She walked fast for some time, then more slowly, and looking straight in front of her, her eyes rested on the shoulder of the young man, whose frock coat had a black velvety collar. His brown hair fell over it, straight and carefully arranged. She noticed his nails, which were longer than one wore them at Yonville. It was one of the clerk's chief occupations to trim them, and for this purpose he kept a special knife in his writing desk. They returned to Yonville by the waterside. In the warm season the bank, wider than at other times, showed to their foot the garden walls whence a few steps led to the river. It flowed noiselessly, swift and cold to the eye. long thin grasses huddled together in it as the current drove them, and spread themselves upon the limpid water like streaming hair. Sometimes at the tip of the reeds, or on the leaf of a water-lily, an insect with fine legs crawled or rested. The sun pierced with a ray the small blue bubbles of the waves that, breaking, followed each other. Branchless old willows mirrored their grey backs in the water. Beyond, all around, the meadows seemed empty. It was the dinner hour at the farms, and the young woman and her companion heard nothing as they walked but the fall of their steps on the earth of the path, the words they spoke, and the sound of Emma's dress rustling around her. The walls of the gardens, with pieces of bottle on their coping, were hot as the glass windows of a conservatory. Wallflowers had sprung up between the bricks, and with the tip of her open sunshade, Madame Bovary, as she passed, made some of their faded flowers crumble into a yellow dust, or a spray of overhanging honeysuckle and clematis caught in its fringe and dangled for a moment over the silk.
This is
they were talking of a troupe of Spanish dancers who were expected shortly at the Bovary Theatre.
For more information, or to volunteer,
if I can,
please visit LibriVox.org.
Had they nothing else to say to one another?
By Icy Jumbo.
Yet their eyes were full of more
Madame
serious
Bovary,
speech,
by Gustave,
and while they forced
Flaubert,
themselves to find
translated
trivial
by
phrases,
Eleanor Marks Aveling,
they felt the same languor stealing over them both.
4.
It was the whisper of the soul.
When the first
deep,
cold day set in, Emma left her bedroom for the sitting room, a long apartment with a low ceiling,
at this strange sweetness,
in which there was on the
mantelpiece
did not think
a
large bunch of corals spread out against the looking
seeking
glass.
its cause.
Seated in her armchair
like
near the
tropical
window,
shores,
she could
throw
see the
over
villagers
the immensity
pass
before
along the
them
pavement.
their inborn softness.
Twice a
An
day,
odorous wind,
Léon went
and
from
we
his
are
office
lulled
to the
by
Léon
this
door.
intoxication without
Emma
a thought
could hear
of
him
the
coming
horizon
from afar.
that we do not even know.
She leant forward, listening,
In
and
one
the young
place,
man
the
glided
ground
past
had been
the
trodden
curtain,
down by the cattle.
always dressed in
they
the
had to
same
step
way,
on large
and
green
without
stones
turning
put
his
here
head.
and there in the mud.
But in the twilight,
She often
when,
stopped a moment
her chin
to look
resting
where
on
to
her
place
left
her
hand,
foot,
she let the
and
embroidery she
tottering
had
on a
begun
stone that
fall on
shook,
her knees.
her arms
She
outspread,
often shuddered
a
at
form
the
bent
apparition of
forward
this
with a
shadow
look of
suddenly
indecision.
gliding past.
She would laugh, afraid
She
of
would
falling
get up
into the puddles
and order
of
the
water.
table to be laid.
When they arrived in front of her garden,
Monsieur Homais
Madame
called at
Bovary
dinner
opened
time.
the little gate,
Skull
ran
cap
up the
in
steps
hand,
and
he
disappeared.
came in on tiptoe,
Léon
in order to
returned
disturb
his
no
office.
one,
His
always
chief was
repeating
away.
the same phrase.
He just glanced
"Good
at the
evening,
briefs,
everybody."
then cut himself a pen,
Then, when
and
he
at
had
last
taken
took
his
up
seat
hat
at the
and went
table
out.
between the pair, he asked the doctor
He went
about
to
his
La Pâture,
patients,
at the
and
top
the
of the
latter
Argueil
consulted
hills,
his
at
as
the
to the
beginning of the
probability of
forest.
their payment.
He threw himself
Next,
upon the
they
ground
talked
under
of
the
what
pines
was in the paper.
and watched the sky through his fingers.
Homais, by this hour,
How
knew it
bored I
almost
am,
by
he said
heart,
to himself.
and he
How
repeated it
bored
from
I am.
end to end, with
He
the
thought he was to be
reflections of the
pitied
penny
for living in
aligners,
this village,
and all
with
the
Homais
stories
for a
of
friend
individual
and Monsieur
catastrophes that had
Guillaumin for a
occurred in
master.
France or abroad.
The latter,
But
entirely
the subject
absorbed by his
becoming
business,
exhausted,
wearing
he was not
gold-rimmed
slow in
spectacles
throwing
and
out
red
some
whiskers
remarks
over
on
a
the
white
dishes before
cravat,
him.
understood nothing of
Sometimes
mental
even,
refinements,
half rising,
though he affected
he
a stiff
delicately
English
pointed
manner,
out to Madame
which in the beginning
tenderest
had
morsel,
impressed the clerk.
or turning to the servant,
As
gave
to
her
the
some
chemist's
advice on the
spouse,
manipulation of
she
stews
was the best
and
wife
the
in
hygiene
Normandy,
of seasoning.
gentle as a sheep,
He talked
loving her
aroma,
children, her father,
osmazome,
her mother, her
juices
cousins,
and gelatin,
weeping
in a
for others'
bewildering manner.
woes, letting everything
Moreover,
go in her
Homais,
household,
with his head
and
fuller of
detesting
recipes
corsets,
than his shop of jars,
but so slow of
excelled in
movement,
making all
such a
kinds of
bore to
preserves,
listen to,
vinegars,
so
and sweet
common
liqueurs.
in appearance,
He
and
knew
of
also
such
all the
restricted
latest
conversation,
inventions in economic
that although
stoves,
she was 30,
together
he
with the
only
art
20,
of preserving cheese,
although they slept in
and
rooms
of
next
curing
each
sick
other,
wines.
and he spoke to her daily,
At 8 o'clock,
he never
Gustave
thought that
came
she
to
might
fetch
be a
him to
woman
shut
for
up the
another,
shop.
or that she
Then
possessed anything
Monsieur
else
Homais
of her
gave him a
sex
sly
than the
look,
gown.
especially if Félicité
And what else was there?
For he half
Binet,
noticed that
a few
his apprentice
shopkeepers,
was fond
two
of
or
the
three
doctor's
publicans,
house.
the curé,
The young
and finally
dog, he
Monsieur
said, is
Tuvache,
beginning
the
to have
mayor,
ideas,
with his
and
two
the devil
sons,
take me if
rich,
I don't believe
crabbed,
he's in love
obtuse
with your
persons
servant.
who farmed their own lands,
But a more
and had
serious
feasts
fault
among
with which he
themselves,
reproached Gustave
bigoted to boot,
was his constantly
and quite
listening to
unbearable
conversation.
companions.
On Sunday,
But
for
from
example,
the general
one
background of
could
all
not
these
get him
human
out
faces,
of the dining room,
Emma's
whither
stood
Madame
out
Homais had
isolated
called him
and
to
yet
fetch the
farthest
children,
off.
who were
For
falling
between
asleep
her
in
and
the
him,
armchairs
he seemed
and
to
dragging
see a
down
vague
with their
abyss.
backs calico chair covers
In the beginning,
that were too large.
he had called on her several times,
Not
along
many
with a
people
druggist.
came to these soirées
Charles
at the
had
chemist's.
not appeared
His
particularly anxious
scandal-mongering
to see
and
him
political
again,
opinions,
and Léon
having
did not know
successfully
what to do
alienated
between
various
his fear of being
respectable
indiscreet
persons from him.
and the desire for an
The
intimacy
clerk never
that
failed
seemed
to be
almost
there.
impossible.
possible.
As soon as he heard the bell, he ran to meet Madame Bovary, took her shawl, and put away under the shop counter the thick list shoes that she wore over her boots when there was snow. First, they played some hands at 31. Next, Monsieur Homais played écarté with Emma. Léon, behind her, gave her advice. Standing up with his hands on the back of her chair, he saw the teeth of her comb that bit into her chignon. With every movement that she made to throw her cards, the right side of her dress was drawn up. From her turned-up hair a dark colour fell over her back, and growing gradually paler, lost itself little by little into the shade. Then her dress fell on both sides of her chair, puffing out full of folds, and reached the ground. When Léon occasionally felt the sole of his boot resting on it, he drew back as if he had trodden upon someone. When the game of cards was over, the druggist and the doctor played dominoes, and Emma, changing her place, leant her elbow on the table, turning over the leaves of l'Illustration. She had brought her lady's journal with her. Léon sat down near her. They looked at the engravings together, and waited for one another at the bottom of the pages. She often begged him to read her the verses. Léon declaimed them in a languid voice, to which he carefully gave a dying fall in the love passages. But the noise of the dominoes annoyed him. Monsieur Homais was strong at the game. He could beat Charles and give him a double six. Then the 300 finished, they both stretched themselves out in front of the fire, and were soon asleep. The fire was dying out in the cinders. The teapot was empty. Léon was still reading. Emma listened to him, mechanically turning around the lampshade, on the gauze of which were painted clowns in carriages, and tightrope dances with their balancing poles. Léon stopped, pointing with a gesture to his sleeping audience. Then they talked in low tones, and their conversation seemed the more sweet to them because it was unheard. Thus a kind of bond was established between them, a constant commerce of books and of romances. Monsieur Bovary, little given to jealousy, did not trouble himself about it. On his birthday he received a beautiful phrenological head, all marked with figures to the thorax, and painted blue. This was an attention of the clerk's. He showed him many others, even to doing errands for him at Rouen, and the book of a novelist having made the mania for cactuses fashionable, Léon bought some for Madame Bovary, bringing them back on his knees in the hirondelle, pricking his fingers on their hard hairs. She had a board with a balustrade fixed against her window to hold the pots. The clerk, too, had his small hanging garden. They saw each other tending their flowers at their windows. Of the windows of the village there was one yet more often occupied. For on Sundays, from morning to night, and every morning when the weather was bright, one could see at the dormer window of the garret the profile of Monsieur Binet bending over his lathe, whose monotonous humming could be heard at the Lion d'Or. One evening, on coming home, Léon found in his room a rug in velvet and wool, with leaves on a pale ground, of Madame Bovary. He called Madame Homais. Monsieur this Homais, is a LibriVox recording. The children, the cook, all LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Everyone wanted to see more information or to volunteer. Why did the please visit LibriVox.org. It looked queer. Recording by They decided Jumbo. That she must be his lover. Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. He made this seem likely. Translated so ceaselessly by Eleanor talk of her charms and of her wit. So much 5. So that Binet once roughly answered him. It was a Sunday in February, to me, since an afternoon when the snow was falling. He tortured himself to find out how he could make his declaration to her. Monsieur Léon, and was always halting between the fear of being built in the valley a mile and a half being such a coward. He wept. The druggist had taken Napoleon and Athalie to give them some exercise. Took energetic resolutions, accompanied them, wrote letters carrying the umbrellas on his shoulder. Put it off to times that he again deferred. Nothing, however, could be less curious than this curiosity. He set out with determination to dare all ground, on which this resolution soon amid a mass of sand and stones were a few brake Charles, dropping in, rusty, invited him to jump into his chaise to go with him to see by a number of little windows. He at once accepted. The building was unfinished to Madame, and the sky could be seen through the joists of the roofing. Was he not attached to the stop plank of the gable, As
a bunch
Emma,
of straw mixed with corn ears fluttered its tricoloured ribbons in the wind. She thought, must come suddenly. Was talking with great outbursts. He explained to the company the future of the skies of this establishment, which falls upon life, computed the strength of the floorings, roots up the will like a leaf, and sweeps the whole heart into the yardstick, such as Monsieur Binet possessed that on the terrace of houses it makes lakes. Emma, when the pipes who had taken his arm, and she would lightly against his shoulder, and she looked at the sun's disk, shedding afar through the mist his pale splendour. End of Part 2, Chapter 4. Charles was there. His cap was drawn down over his eyebrows, and his two thick lips were trembling, which added a look of stupidity to his face. His very back, his calm back, was irritating to behold, and she saw written upon his coat all the platitude of the bearer. While she was considering him thus, tasting in her irritation a sort of depraved pleasure, Léon made a step forward. The cold that made him pale seemed to add a more gentle languor to his face. Between his cravat and his neck the somewhat loose collar of his shirt showed the skin. The lobe of his ear looked out from beneath a lock of hair, and his large blue eyes, raised to the clouds, seemed to Emma more limpid and more beautiful than those mountain lakes where the heavens are mirrored. "Wretched boy!" suddenly cried the chemist, and he ran to his son, who had just precipitated himself into a heap of lime in order to whiten his boots. At the reproaches with which he was being overwhelmed, Napoleon began to roar, while Justin dried his shoes with a wisp of straw. But a knife was wanted. Charles offered his. "Ah," she said to herself, "he carried a knife in his pocket like a peasant." The hoarfrost was falling, and they turned back to Yonville. In the evening, Madame Bovary did not go to her neighbours, and when Charles had left, and she felt herself alone, the comparison re-began with the clearness of a sensation almost actual, and with that lengthening of perspective which memory gives to things. Looking from her bed at the clean fire that was burning, she still saw, as she had down there, Léon standing up with one hand behind his cane, and with the other holding Athalie, who was quietly sucking a piece of ice. She thought him charming. She could not tear herself away from him. She recalled his other attitudes on other days, the words he had spoken, the sound of his voice, his whole person, and she repeated, pouting out her lips as if for a kiss, "Yes, charming, charming. Is he not in love?" she asked herself. "But with whom? With me?" All the proofs arose before her at once. Her heart leapt. The flame of the fire threw a joyous light upon the ceiling. She turned on her back, stretching out her arms. Then began the eternal lamentation. Oh, if heaven had outwilled it! And why not? What had prevented it? When Charles came home at midnight, she seemed to have just awakened, and as he made a noise undressing, she complained of a headache, then asked carelessly what had happened that evening. "Monsieur Léon," he said, "went to his room early." She could not help smiling, and she fell asleep, her soul filled with a new delight. The next day, at dusk, she received a visit from Monsieur Lheureux, the draper. He was a man of ability, was this shopkeeper. Born a Gascon, but bred a Norman, he grafted upon his southern volubility the cunning of the Cauchois. His fat, flabby, beardless face seemed dyed by a decoction of licorice, and his white hair made even more vivid the keen brilliance of his small black eyes. No one knew what he had been formerly. A pedlar, said some, a banker at Routot, according to others. What was certain was that he made complex calculations in his head that would have frightened Binet himself. Polite to obsequiousness, he always held himself with his back bent in the position of one who bows or who invites. After leaving at the door his hat surrounded with crape, he put down a green bandbox on the table, and began by complaining to Madame with many civilities that he should have remained till that day without gaining her confidence. A poor shop like his was not made to attract a fashionable lady. He emphasized the words. Yet she had only to command, and he would undertake to provide her with anything she might wish, either in haberdashery or linen, millinery or fancy goods, for he went to town regularly 4 times a month. He was connected with the best houses. You could speak of him at the Trois Frères, at the Barbe d'Or, or at the Grand Sauvage. All these gentlemen knew him as well as the insides of their pockets. Today, then, he had come to show Madame, in passing, various articles he happened to have, thanks to the most rare opportunity, and he pulled out half a dozen embroidered collars from the box. Madame Bovary examined them. "I do not require anything," she said. Then Monsieur Lheureux delicately exhibited 3 Algerian scarves, several packets of English needles, a pair of straw slippers, and finally 4 egg cups in cocoanut wood, carved in open work by convicts. Then, with both hands on the table, his neck stretched out, his figure bent forward, open-mouthed, he watched Emma's look, who was walking up and down undecided amid these goods. From time to time, as if to remove some dust, he filliped with his nail the silk of the scarves spread out at full length, and they rustled with a little noise, making in the green twilight the gold spangles of their tissue scintillate like little stars. "How much are they?" "A mere nothing," he replied, "a mere nothing. But there's no hurry. Whenever it's convenient. We are not Jews." She reflected for a few moments, and ended again by declining Monsieur Lheureux's offer. He replied quite unconcernedly, "Very well. We shall understand one another by and by. I have always got on with ladies, if I didn't with my own." Emma smiled. "I wanted to tell you," he went on good-naturedly, after his joke, "that it isn't the money I should trouble about. Why, I could give you some if need be." She made a gesture of surprise. "Ah," he said quickly, and in a low voice, "I shouldn't have to go far to find you some, rely on that." And he began asking after Père Tellier, the proprietor of the Café Français, whom Monsieur Bovary was then attending. "What's the matter with Père Tellier? He coughs so that he shakes his whole house, and I'm afraid that he'll soon want a deal covering rather than a flannel vest. He was such a rake as a young man. Those sort of people, madame, have not the least regularity. He's burnt up with brandy. Still, it's sad, all the same, to see an acquaintance go off." And while he fastened up his box, he discoursed about the doctor's patients. "It's the weather, no doubt," he said, looking frowningly at the floor, "that causes these illnesses. I, too, don't feel the thing. One of these days I shall even have to consult the doctor for a pain I have in my back. Well, good-bye, Madame Bovary. At your service, your very humble servant." And he closed the door gently. Emma had her dinner served in her bedroom on a tray by the fireside. She was a long time over it. Everything was well with her. "How good I was," she said to herself, thinking of the scarves. She heard some steps on the stairs. It was Léon. She got up and took from the chest of drawers the first pile of dusters to be hemmed. When he came in, she seemed very busy. The conversation languished. Madame Bovary gave it up every few minutes, whilst he himself seemed quite embarrassed. Seated on a low chair near the fire, he turned round in his fingers the ivory thimble case. She stitched on, or from time to time turned down the hem of the cloth with her nail. She did not speak. He was silent, captivated by her silence, as he would have been by her speech. "Poor fellow," she thought. "How have I displeased her?" he asked himself. At last, however, Léon said that he should have, one of these days, to go to Rouen on some office business. "Your music subscription is out. Am I to renew it?" "No," she replied. "Why?" "Because," and pursing her lips she slowly drew a long stitch of grey thread. This work irritated Léon. It seemed to roughen the ends of her fingers. A gallant phrase came into his head, but he did not risk it. "Then you are giving it up?" he went on. "What?" she asked hurriedly. "Music? Ah, yes. Have I not my house to look after, my husband to attend to, 1,000 things, in fact, many duties that must be considered first?" She looked at the clock. Charles was late. Then she affected anxiety. 2 or 3 times she even repeated, "He is so good." The clerk was fond of Monsieur Bovary, but this tenderness on his behalf astonished him unpleasantly. Nevertheless, he took up on his praises, which he said every one was singing, especially the chemist. "Ah, he is a good fellow," continued Emma. "Certainly," replied the clerk. And he began talking of Madame Homais, whose very untidy appearance generally made them laugh. "What does it matter?" interrupted Emma. "A good housewife does not trouble about her appearance." Then she relapsed into silence. It was the same on the following days. Her talks, her manners, everything changed. She took interest in the housework, went to church regularly, and looked after her servant with more severity. She took Berthe from the nurse. When visitors called, Félicité brought her in, and Madame Bovary undressed her to show off her limbs. She declared she adored children. This was her consolation, her joy, her passion, and she accompanied her caresses with lyrical outburst which would have reminded anyone but the Yonville people of Sachette in Notre Dame de Paris. When Charles came home he found his slippers put to warm near the fire. His waistcoat now never wanted lining, nor his shirt buttons, and it was quite a pleasure to see in the cupboard the nightcaps arranged in piles of the same height. She no longer grumbled as formerly at taking a turn in the garden. What he proposed was always done, although she did not understand the wishes to which she submitted without a murmur. And when Léon saw him by his fireside after dinner, his 2 hands on his stomach, his 2 feet on the fender, his 2 cheeks red with feeding, his eyes moist with happiness, the child crawling along the carpet, and this woman with the slender waist who came behind his armchair to kiss his forehead, what madness, he said to himself, and how to reach her? And thus she seemed so virtuous and inaccessible to him that he lost all hope, even the faintest. But by this renunciation he placed her on an extraordinary pinnacle. To him she stood outside those fleshly attributes from which he had nothing to obtain, and in his heart she rose ever, and became farther removed from him after the magnificent manner of an apotheosis that is taking wing. It was one of those pure feelings that do not interfere with life, that are cultivated because they are rare, and whose loss would afflict more than their passion rejoices. Emma grew thinner, her cheeks paler, her face longer. With her black hair, her large eyes, her aquiline nose, her bird-like walk, and always silent now, did she not seem to be passing through life, scarcely touching it, and to bear on her brow the vague impress of some divine destiny? She was so sad and so calm, at once so gentle and so reserved, that near her one felt oneself seized by an icy charm, as we shudder in churches at the perfume of the flowers mingling with the cold of the marble. The others did not even escape from this seduction. The chemist said, "She is a woman of great parts, who wouldn't be misplaced in a sub-prefecture." The housewives admired her economy, the patients her politeness, the poor her charity. But she was eaten up with desires, with rage, with hate. That dress with the narrow folds hid a distracted fear, of whose torment those chaste lips said nothing. She was in love with Léon, and sought solitude that she might with the more ease delight in his image. The sight of his form troubled the voluptuousness of this mediation. Emma thrilled at the sound of his step. Then in his presence the emotion subsided, and afterwards there remained to her only an immense astonishment that ended in sorrow. Léon did not know that when he left her, in despair she rose after he had gone to see him in the street. She concerned herself about his comings and goings. She watched his face. She invented quite a history to find an excuse for going to his room. The chemist's wife seemed happy to her to sleep under the same roof, and her thoughts constantly centred upon this house, like the Lion d'Or pigeons who came there to dip their red feet and white wings in its gutters. But the more Emma recognized her love, the more she crushed it down, that it might not be evident, that she might make it less. She would have liked Léon to guess it, and she imagined chances, catastrophes that should facilitate this. What restrained her was, no doubt, idleness and fear, and a sense of shame also. She thought she had repulsed him too much, that the time was past, that all was lost. Then pride and joy of being able to say to herself, "I am virtuous," and to look at herself in the glass taking resigned poses, consoled her a little for the sacrifice she believed she was making. Then the lusts of the flesh, the longing for money, and the melancholy of passion all blended themselves into one suffering, and instead of turning her thoughts from it, she clave to it the more, urging herself to pain, and seeking everywhere occasion for it. She was irritated by an ill-served dish or by a half-open door, bewailed the velvets she had not, the happiness she had missed, her too exalted dreams, her narrow home. What exasperated her was that Charles did not seem to notice her anguish. His conviction that he was making her happy seemed to her an imbecile insult, and his sureness on this point ingratitude. For whose sake, then, was she virtuous? Was it not for him, the obstacle to all felicity, the cause of all misery, and, as it were, the sharp clasp of that complex strap that buckled her in on all sides? On him alone, then, she concentrated all the various hatreds that resulted from her boredom, and every effort to diminish only augmented it, for this useless trouble was added to the other reasons for despair, and contributed still more to the separation between them. Her own gentleness to herself made her rebel against him. Domestic mediocrity drove her to lewd fancies, marriage tenderness to adulterous desires. She would have liked Charles to beat her, that she might have a better right to hate him, to revenge herself upon him. She was surprised sometimes at the atrocious conjectures that came into her thoughts, and she had to go on smiling, to hear repeated to her at all hours that she was happy, to pretend to be happy, to let it be believed. Yet she had loathing of this hypocrisy. She was seized with the temptation to flee somewhere with Léon, to try a new life, but at once a vague chasm full of darkness opened within her soul. Besides, he no longer loves me, she thought. What is to become of me? What help is to be hoped for? What consolation? What solace? She was left broken, breathless, inert, sobbing in a low voice with flowing tears. "Why don't you tell master?" the servant asked her when she came in during these crises. "It is the nerves," said Emma. "Do not speak to him of it. It would worry him." "Ah, yes," Félicité went on. "You are just like Lagarine, Père Guérin's daughter, the fisherman at Pollet that I used to know at Dieppe before I came to you. She was so sad to see her standing upright on the threshold of her house. She seemed to you like a winding sheet spread out before the door. Her illness, it appears, was a kind of fog that she had in her head, and the doctors could do nothing, nor the priest either. When she was taken too bad, she went off alone to the seashore, so that the customs officer, going his rounds, often found her lying flat on her face, crying on the shingle. Then, after her marriage, it went off, they say." "But with me," replied Emma, "it was after marriage that it began." End of Part 2, Chapter 5.